We're going to get started. So I want to say good afternoon to everyone and thank you so much for coming to this session titled Environmental Engineering Laboratory Courses from a University Teaching Lab to a Home Kitchen. And we get the benefit of our 5 speakers who I have heard gave this presentation also yesterday, so we'll benefit from them having had a practice run before. And so I'm my name is Ellie Lawson. I'm from the Hub for Innovation in Learning and Technology at Michigan State, and it's my great pleasure to be our moderator today. And part of that job is to introduce our great set of speakers. So first, we have Susan J. Maston, who's professor in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at MSU. We have Mary J. Kiersitz, who's associate professor in the Department of Civil, Architectural, and Environmental Engineering at the University of Texas at Austin. We have Lutgard Raskin, who is the Vernon L. Snowyk Distinguished University Professor in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And then Pedro Puente, who's a PhD student in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering, also from the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And lastly, we have Sirjan Agrawal, who's Associate Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering at the University of Alaska, Fairbanks. So we're very pleased to have this geographically diverse group all here together in our Zoom. And we will begin with a presentation that I believe Susan will be sharing the slides.
So I'm going to let Pedro lead off, and we'll each hit a little piece to this talk, and then hopefully we have some really vibrant discussion about what we've all worked on for the last year and some. So Pedro, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you. So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our presentation. We'll be talking about the Environmental Engineering Laboratory from Home, overcoming the remote learning challenges. Okay, and so next slide, please.
Sorry.
Okay, so for today's presentation, we will have Professor Susan Maston from the University of Michigan, Sirjan Agrawal from the University of Alaska Fairbanks, Lutgard Raskin and Pedro Puente, myself from the University of Michigan, and Mary Jo Kiersitz from the University of Texas. Okay, so what was the motivation for this shift from the laboratory to a home kitchen? The reason that everybody knows is that COVID-19 pandemic hit right on the middle of winter 2020. So what happened, the remote teaching mode had to be adopted immediately, to keep everybody safe. So videotaping of laboratory experiments was the first resource that professors use in their classes, as long as analyzing external data, third-party data. But as the pandemic moved on over the summer and over to fall 2020 and the winter 2021, we had the chance to improve this way of teaching, and there was a strong desire to move away from that videotaping and having the students taking a hands-on experience, having a more realistic, more valuable experience. So I'm gonna let Susan explain how this initiative started.
Okay, so when I agreed in fall 2019 that I would redesign our undergraduate environmental engineering lab, I had absolutely no clue, as none of us would have had, that would be in the midst of a global pandemic when I was trying to do that. So tasked with this challenge, in the summer of 2020, I reached out to colleagues, actually via Twitter, to see if anyone else had to also adopt their classes and how they were dealing with it. Not surprisingly, I wasn't alone, and the response from the environmental engineering community was both great and gracious. And so from Twitter, we created a Slack group, and it was on that Slack group that we shared ideas, we shared experiences, we shared resources, and from that, this collaboration really developed. So my goal with the environmental engineering lab was to afford the students a hands-on opportunity. I didn't want them to just be watching more videos and looking at the computer screen. And I wanted the learning experience to be relevant to their careers as environmental engineers. So the first thing at the same time, I also reached out to alumni from our program and a number of our employers to assess what they thought would be the most important content. So with their support, with the support of the environmental engineering community, I designed an environmental engineering lab course that focused on designing sampling and lab and monitoring plans, collecting and preserving samples, and conducting field analyses. I shared all of this material back with the community, actually even asked some of the alumni to help in terms of reviewing materials, so we're getting feedback all summer, last summer. And through this collaboration, the same approach was then adopted by a number of my colleagues. So what I developed were 4 laboratory assignments that the students could do using commercial test kits. So I wanted to create these labs. Students could buy relatively inexpensive pool aquarium type test kits, and then they could use those for their labs. So we did a lab looking at the variability of tap water and bottled water. They had to look up the consumer confidence report, so they learned something about their own water source and water supply, and then they measured hardness and alkalinity and compared that to their consumer confidence report or to the bottled water information that was available online. We did another lab on chlorine kinetics, and we looked at the effect of sunlight and temperature on chlorine decay. And I have to give my mom credit for this, because my mom was complaining about keeping the chlorine level in the swimming pool in the backyard on a hot summer day. And I was like, okay, we can design an experiment based on that. So that's what we did. And that was really focused then on looking at chlorine decay or dechlorination in a wastewater treatment plant. We looked at the trophic level of surface water. So they measured nitrogen and phosphorus, and they also did pH and temperature in that surface water. And then we looked at the effect of soil type and pH and conductivity, and that was designed around identifying service line materials. We also did 4 paper assignments. The first one was just a statistical analysis of environmental data. We did a assignment where we collaborated with a public policy class in our James Madison College, and the students were each paired with a student from the public policy program, and they wrote a policy statement on consumer grade fireworks. We looked at the effect of flushing household plumbing systems. That was actually designed around New Zealand, because they have a flush a mug campaign again to try and protect against lead in drinking water. So we looked at, was that sufficient? How did you, and they had to actually provide a recommendation to the Ministry of Environment, which they didn't send in, but that was how it was designed in New Zealand. And then we looked at monitoring wastewater discharges and regulations. And then they took that information that they had learned in the course, and then their final project was one where they had to design and conduct appropriate experimentations based on ABET accreditation, and they could choose one of 7 objectives and then design that experiment. And there was a lot of help needed to get them to actually feel confident to do that, but it was really rewarding to see them actually design their own experiments. Some of the challenges, students were really initially very diffident about conducting at-home tests. I kept telling them initially they did pH and alkalinity first, and I kept telling them, look, my mom's 85 years old. She does these on the swimming pool. You can handle this. And and it was rewarding to see their confidence increase during the semester. I did midterm course feedback, realized that I had the 6 labs I had planned was just overly ambitious, so we reduced the hands-on work to 4 labs. Students found working in teams remotely more difficult than in person, and there was a challenge in all the courses I taught. But they liked doing the labs when it was convenient, and many wrote in the final reflection that they actually felt that they had learned more in the remote lab than they would have in an in-person lab. So I will turn it over to Sergio.
Thank you, Susan. Hello, everyone. I'm Srijan Agarwal from University of Alaska Fairbanks. So my course was CE 341, Introduction to Environmental Engineering for juniors, and this is a junior level required course for civil engineering students, undergraduates. And this is a slightly more heavy course because it has both theory and lab combined. A lot of universities, I think like Susan's was just a lab course. A lot of universities do them separate, have a theory course in environmental engineering separate than a lab course. Traditionally, the way here it's been taught here has been both of them together. So that was the format of the course, 3-hour lecture and 3-hour lab per week. And then if you look at the next bullet points here, they are kind of following the same pattern. There were 4 home lab assignments, which were borrowed from Susan. And this is the beauty of this thing. I didn't know Susan before, and I met Susan on Twitter, and we started interacting in the Slack group, and we were all thinking of the same questions: how to give students a better experience in the fall, and something beyond going, as Pedro said, not doing the video thing again. We had done that for when people transitioned suddenly over the spring break. We were given a week's notice. I know some people were given a couple of hours notice, and so we were trying to find ways to make it more interesting for students. And so I borrowed many of these, the labs that Susan had, though I did adapt them. For example, she had some really nice way to different ways of reporting. We stuck to a standard lab report format. We had some constraints there with the new teaching assistants, both in their first semester, and a lot of, we thought it might be more onerous for the students to manage the workload in the course. Then in addition to the lab, these home lab were the hands-on activities, and these were spaced out. So, they each activity probably they had 2 or 3 weeks sometimes to work on these activities. And interspersed between these were labs, which were those paper lab assignments, which they didn't have to do a lot of experimentation, but visiting a drinking water treatment plant. And this was actually a resource created by another environmental engineering faculty pre-pandemic actually, and which is a nice 3D virtual reality video tour. So if you have really, those goggles to look at, and then you could actually, or just your, moving your phone around or scrolling through your screen, you can look at a really nicely water treatment plant. Typically in-person course, we make a visit to the local water treatment plant and the wastewater treatment plant. So those were replaced. And as I said, these are interspersed between the hands-on labs to provide more time for and more flexibility to conduct those. And then finally, we also had 2 modeling labs, which and here we're using a tool called VenSim, and it's a relatively simple systems modeling tool which can provide familiarity to the students using some of these equations. like the microbial growth kinetics, the Michaelis-Mitten kinetics there. So students can really like try to plot some of these things, and it has some nice features as to looking at the sensitivity analysis of like how would a change in the K value or, you know, some constant change the growth rate and such. So I thought this was like a good balance, having like 4 with sort of hands-on lab where they had to do stuff, make measurements, write more detailed reports. And these where there were some limited activities, but still a good amount of learning happening there. So this was the structure of the course. And the way it happened, you know, I mean, there are lots of positives here, as Susan said. And one thing that's not here, I'll say is, you know, one thing that is obvious is people remotely could take this course. So now previously we had, you know, we've offered courses remotely a lot of times because in Alaska and like elsewhere too, people can be, you know, remotely located. We have a lot of small remote communities with, you know, a pretty small population. And there was a student out of Nome, which is a community around 500 odd miles from Fairbanks, and he wanted to take the course. So we had all the our lab kit shipped to that student in Nome. And for other students who were mostly in and around Fairbanks, they could either have it mailed if they wanted to, or pick it up, you know, at a location in the university. So students really liked going out in the fields, you know, to collect water samples. So they were not just doing something that was given to them. And the teaching assistants, the graduate teaching assistants, they did a Zoom introduction session each week for the lab where they would sort of, you know, it was like a work-in session. They would sort of use the same kits and show them how they were doing it. And the students could, if they wanted to, choose to work alongside the, you know, the teaching assistants in that session, or they could go back and you know, spread it out during the week. So there was a lot of flexibility built in, and I'm sure students also measured things that we didn't ask them to, you know, like their water samples or something they were curious about, and you know, which they would probably not do when it's like or not get the chance to do when we are doing in person in a very fixed time, and so these were, I think, so some of the highlights that students were really excited about. But then there were some challenges, like Susan said, remote teamwork was challenging. Most students had to work individually. There were some concerns regarding the accuracy and sensitivity of the test kits. So, you know, if you were doing a lot of drinking water with some temperature variations or even chlorine, sometimes it was hard to see, you know, the kits were not as sensitive to maybe detect small changes. And sometimes data didn't look as interesting. So maybe the experiments could be redesigned to make it, you know, the differences larger so that the measurements are, you know, they provide some trends that students can look at and analyze. And then some students live in, you know, dry cabins. That's what attracts students, many students to Alaska to, you know, get the remote experience. But then they're, you know, it's really rudimentary, the facilities they have in their dry cabin. There's no kitchen, basically. They're just even drinking out of their water bottle. And so they don't have, like, the picture you see on the left is a student not living in the cabin. So he could, you know, arrange this kind of a thing to make temperature measurements in his kitchen. But some students, a couple of them in that course, didn't have that facility. So, you know, we had to make arrangements for them. And then field work, you know, another challenge in this course is usually to make sure that the labs are corresponding with the lecture material. So we are not jumping ahead, or, you know, the schedule can be really, like, if it gets funky, that really doesn't work well with students. So the earliest we could do was in October, the water collection and the measurements on those things from the field for the trophic state of water lab, where they were measuring nitrogen and phosphorus from water collected in local streams and locations. But then by mid-October, we start hitting freeze up, you know, and so some students, you know, had challenged. There was just challenge to get those water samples at that time. So need to consider going forward how to time that more, you know, in a way that they can get samples. So going forward, I think we're making some changes, but overall, I think there were a lot of things that could be interspersed or combined with the regular in-person offering of this course, so keep sort of the best of both worlds and make a better lab offering in the future.
Thanks, Srijan. My name is Mary Jo Kiersitz, and I'm from the University of Texas at Austin. And I was teaching this course, Foundations of Environmental Engineering. So different from my colleagues here in that I was teaching freshmen. And this was a hybrid course, meaning that I had some students that wanted to work in person and some people wanted to be remote. So I took a lot of the great ideas that I got from Susan and my other colleagues here to come up with what I was going to do for the labs in this course. So this was a 2-hour lecture and 3-hour lab per week. And as Srijan was mentioning, you had to, time things such that you were doing things in the lab that corresponded with when you were doing things in the lecture. And I took 2 of the home lab assignments that Susan had described before. So the first one was drinking water quality, pH hardness, and alkalinity. The one thing that was interesting about this one, and actually the second one here, the effective stagnation on chlorine residual in drinking water, is that I hadn't thought before about students that might be colorblind. And so if you see the picture over here to the right, the pink color, they had to look for a color change in this. And when students were on their own doing this, lab assignment at home, they didn't necessarily have somebody right next to them to say, did I get the color change yet? So that was something that interesting that came up as a part of that home lab assignment. Next one, thank you. And we also did 2 paper lab assignments with videos. Like we didn't do everything, in the home lab and the kitchen lab. We did have 2 video assignments, and these were more involved. So we did one on indoor air pollutant emission with CO2 when we had with and without the HVAC system on, and then we also did a salicylic acid partitioning in between oil and water. And then our final project, again, because this was a hybrid course, I had some people wanting to be in person and some people being remote, we had to have a final project for both of those options. And the remote option was one that I had taken from Susan, the effective household agents on wastewater treatment systems. And then the in-person option, we were exploring a potential surrogate for Legionella pneumophila in drinking water. And some of the students that had signed up for the in-person course, for whatever reason, they wanted to do the remote option for the project, which was fine. And we also had the reverse. Students that had signed up for the remote one actually wanted to come in and be with people and do the in-person option. So we had a mixture of students participating in the projects. We had lots of positive things that we found from the at-home labs. The students were really excited to test their own drinking water. And I remember this from being a student. You always wanted to know more about, where did you live and what you were being exposed to. And they also like to compare the water qualities among the different cities. So students would be on the chat in Zoom saying, well, this is what I'm getting in El Paso, and this is what I'm getting in San Antonio versus Austin. So that was a nice conversation. Some of the students that I talked with said that doing the work at home made science seem more accessible. These were kits that they could purchase commercially and use in their own homes, for pool maintenance or spa maintenance, et cetera. And, going through those steps with the TA really made them feel like, yeah, I can do this. It was accessible to them. And how we did this is the labs were conducted live on Zoom, the at-home labs. And so the TA was in front of her camera, doing the experiments with the students. And my job was to monitor the chat. So some students would pipe up and ask a question orally, but a lot of them would put their questions into the chat. And so I was able to help them answer their questions as they went along. And so the TA could just continue to do the work. And as I mentioned before, the students really liked the choice of having the ability to do either the remote or the in-person option for their final project. And I'll show this picture here on the lower left. This is the on-site wastewater treatment system project that I took from Susan. And so the students were testing the effects of various cleaning agents on CO2 production by yeast as a model for microbial activity in a septic system. The challenges of the at-home labs, as Srijan mentioned before, sometimes the remote teamwork could be challenging, but I'm not sure it was that different than the challenges that you have in an in-person team. So just a lot of the same issues were coming up, that some people weren't participating and some people were. Some of the students told me that they missed kind of checking their results in real time with a partner. As you're going through an experiment and you get some data, well, you go to the person next to you and say, well, what did you get? Does this make sense? And, they certainly could have done that on Zoom in the chat, but maybe they just didn't feel free enough to do it. Some students told me that they missed the in-depth labs, by consequence of it being an at-home lab, in particular because I was modifying this for freshmen as compared to my colleagues doing this for juniors and seniors. They had to be simpler labs, and so they missed kind of going through the sort of layers of more complicated labs. But I think we really tried to make up for that in the final project and gave them, really a lot of flexibility in terms of what they did for their final projects. And the last one was interesting to me. Some students felt intimidated to ask questions on Zoom. Plenty of students were, they would raise their hands on Zoom, or they would just speak up, or so many of them would put questions into the chat. So it really surprised me that some students still felt intimidated to ask questions on Zoom. So that might be a good thing for us to discuss during our discussion part here. And how do you, make students feel more free to ask questions, even in something that I perceive to be sort of a low stress environment on the chat, but how can we make them feel more free to ask questions?
All right. So for the University of Michigan, the course name is CEE 366. It's called Environmental Engineering Laboratory for Juniors and Seniors, and they are exclusively from environmental engineering, some civil also. Basically, it was redesigned to be fully remote because we were fully online over the winter 2021. The instructor for this course was Professor Lud Raskin. She was in charge of the 2-hour lecture on Fridays. And myself, Pedro Puente, I was a graduate student instructor, which is a TA position, similar to it. And I was in charge of the lab sessions. The lab sessions were supposed to be 3 hours long every Tuesday and Wednesday. So we split the groups into 2 different days. And we also have the collaboration of Rob Zulewski. He's the technical communication instructor. So for this class, there will be this instructor in charge of giving feedback to the students in terms of how to write technical reports and how to make technical presentations, depending on the audience that they are facing. So the idea was to have the students gain on hands-on experience with analytical measurements of different types of samples, being this air, water, and soil, and the ability to solve environmental engineering processes and challenges. So the course was emphasized on data analysis, on experimental design, on report writing, oral presentations, and teamwork throughout 3 modules, which I'm going to explain as we move on. And the supplies and the laboratory kits were picked up by the students. Most of them, I would say around the 95% of the students, they were in Ann Arbor, Michigan. But some students, they were also in other cities in Michigan, like Grand Rapids, St. Joseph, Troy, Farmington Hills. And we have a couple of students who were out of state in North Carolina and Atlanta. So we had to mail them the supplies. And the idea for these modules that we developed for this class was to develop scenarios where students would work as consulting engineers. So they would be working for a firm. They would have to solve a problem and provide the report to their clients and give them information and basically based on the results that they get during the lab practices at home. So basically we sent a kit individually to each student. So all of them had to perform the analysis at home. So for module 1, we had this scenario where there was a customer, Mrs. Sarah customer actually, and her goal was to purchase a home. So she was looking at different options. She had different 5 or 4 options depending on the number of members in the group that we established beforehand. And she was concerned about the water quality in the potential home that she would buy. Also, she was wondering about the lead concentration on the pipes. So that's why they had to characterize soil. There were 4 lab sessions for this module. On the first lab session, they characterized soil by particle size and the composition of soil. And we had the issue that the class was in winter already, so everything was frozen here in Michigan. So we had to send them a couple of samples to analyze. So that was one of the initial changes that we had to do to the initial idea that we had to the class. Then for the second lab session, they had to characterize the water distribution in the pipes in their houses. No, they had to measure the length, what is the volume from the heater to the tap, and how long would it take to get a sample from the distribution system. So that was a kind of a preparation for the third laboratory in which they measured the chlorine concentration, and we worked on the kinetics of chlorine dissipation over time. For the fourth lab session, we measured alkalinity and hardness in water. So that was kind of challenging as well, because some students might have surface water and others would have groundwater. No? So the properties are very different, and we had to adapt the experiments to each scenario. The final deliverable was a report in which they would present the findings to Mrs. Sarah Customer, so she can take an informed decision on which house she would purchase. For the second module, we had the resource recovery from food waste with anaerobic digestion. So the goal for this scenario was to provide guidance to water resource recovery facility superintendent on the benefits of implementing co-digestion. No? So what we did is that we developed 5 different food waste recipes in which we used a source of easily degradable carbohydrates, sources of complex carbohydrates, sources of lipids, and sources of proteins. And we try to make these recipes to match pre-consumer food waste, household food waste, a grease trap, an industrial facility, an industrial processing facility of food, and finally an equal parts recipe, where they had equal portions of easily degradable carbohydrates, complex carbohydrates, lipids, and protein. Okay? So the idea was to test, basically do a fast BMP test, biochemical methane potential, in which they would generate this biogas, and they would be measuring it to determine which recipe would provide the most biogas, and that would be the recommendation that they would provide to the superintendent. They would also have to make calculations based on the nutrients present on the supernatant, nitrogen and phosphorus, that would eventually be recirculated to the main wastewater treatment system. So they would have to calculate additionally the biosolids generated with the addition of food waste. For this laboratory, there were 4 sessions. The first session was the setup of the digesters. We sent an anaerobic digester inocula with the food waste recipes. The second last session would be the measurement of biogas using this syringe and this needle that you can see in that picture. So they would be quantifying biogas generation every day. And finally, they would have the last laboratory in which they measure nitrogen and phosphorus in the supernatant after using a coffee filter to remove the solids. And the deliverable is a technical written report for the superintendent, which was different than the first module because it was for a customer. So for this second module, they could use more technical language and explain the benefits of doing this co-digestion. No? Some issues here, a lot of biogas generation, so they had to measure biogas more frequently. And they had to, we didn't use the whole 3 hours of the laboratory, but rather a smaller times portion, because they had to do these measurements every day. No? So to compensate the time, we had shorter laboratory sessions. Finally, for module 3, for the indoor air quality, this was the most independent lab for these students. We provided guidance for the first module, a lot of guidance, a lot of guidance basically. For the second module, we provided less guidance, so they were more free in terms of measuring whenever they can, whenever they would, to provide their reports. And for module 3, they would need to design the experiments. And the idea for this is that the scenario was that the Washington County Health Department has hired their engineering firm in order to provide a presentation about the benefits of ventilation to small business owners to be safe regarding COVID-19. No? So what we used was a CO2 sensor, which would measure CO2, and the idea was to measure this CO2 as a proxy for COVID concentration inside the room. So we took information available on Twitter by Professor Jose Luis Jimenez from the University of Colorado and Professor Lindsay Marr from Virginia Tech. They have developed models and where they demonstrate that COVID-19 is an airborne disease. So the students had to use the one box model provided by Lindsay Marr, and they had to test different scenarios depending on what they chose for the experiment, and basically compare a non-ventilated room with a ventilated room. And those results had to be presented to the small business owners. And there were several businesses that we provided. There was like a dentist office, a gym, a small restaurant, home day care, and others, no? And the final deliverable for this module was a technical presentation. So they didn't have to write a report, but actually do the presentation to the business owners as what were the recommendations that they would give based on the results that they found over their experimentation. No? Can you go to the next slide, please? Okay, great. So what happened with the environmental engineering laboratory in University of Michigan? We have some positive aspects, no? There was a great emphasis in technical communication. As I mentioned before, we had the technical communications instructor, Rob Zulowski. He took an hour to provide information on how to write technical reports and an extra hour on how to do the technical presentations, and he would give feedback on drafts before they submit the final version. There were team evaluations after each module. So the students would rate their own teammates based on their involvement on gathering data and the analysis of the data and the writing of the reports. And we use Slack. We created a channel for the class with different sub-channels in it to classify the information and the questions that they would provide. And they absolutely loved it. So Slack was very, very useful. On the other hand, we had to be constantly paying attention to the app and be providing feedback even on the weekends as well. So the challenges, we had to make some adjustments because we found out that the lab sessions were too long. Initially, there were 3 hours and they had to take the measurements every day in the second module, for instance, or they had to do triplicate readings in the first module for the drinking water portion. So they were complaining and they didn't understand fully why they would need the triplicates, no? So we had to give them more explanation on what is the value of this for statistical significance. And yeah, the students found it difficult to work on their own and frequently asked for help and support. For the lab sessions, I can mention that what I use is this setup that I am using right now, where my camera would be turned on, but I would have a second connection to the Zoom meeting using my telephone and my headphones. No? So during the lab sessions, we would do tests of the kits. We would run fast tests on tap water. I would ask them to do 5 or 6 readings while I do them as well at the same time. And they could ask their questions by unmuting themselves on Zoom. So because everybody was busy doing their own tests, that was more useful for everybody. Okay, so for the future versions, Susan, would you like to take on this slide? I think you're muted.
Sorry. So I tried to summarize some of the thoughts from all of us. And I think all of us have agreed that there's a significant positive aspect to this at-home component to regular labs. And really looking at how can we incorporate that in the future. We felt that it ensures each student collects the real samples. They actually perform all the experiments and they analyze it, rather than what often happens in a lab setting where somebody kind of stands in the back and somebody's doing all the lab work. We also felt that it was really beneficial to have students address a realistic problem. So rethinking the goal of each of the labs was a bit of a challenge, I think, initially for all of us, but that really helped students get engaged in what they were doing, that it wasn't just kind of this exercise to finish the lab, that there was some benefit. In the future, and this has been mentioned, there's a challenge with the accuracy and the precision of these commercially available, inexpensive kits. So we're looking at how can we use laboratory equipment, whether students can check out equipment so that they can obtain more accurate and precise measurements. For both Luton and I, we were looking at meeting the ABET accreditation requirements. So that's why you see the soil, water, and air. And that's part of our requirements or the program criteria for environmental. So we incorporated that in there. But it really involves, the whole data analysis, experimental design, report writing, being able to use or present material in various different ways for different audiences, and then working together in a team. So I think all of us are looking at, ways that we can continue what we've done, what we've learned in this past year, refining the methodology, and I think we're all hoping that we can continue working together as colleagues on a teaching course, which I think for all of us, this was something very new, that we had never really collaborated across universities on such a course. So happy to answer questions. We're actually almost at the end, but I don't know, I'm willing to stay and answer questions if we're allowed to, Ellie, and my colleagues are willing to too.
Yes, so people are welcome to stay beyond the time if they have questions, but I'll take this opportunity to thank our audience who have been here this whole time. And if you do need to leave to get ready for the next session or any 1 o'clock meeting, we totally understand.
I actually had one comment. Your last set of points made me think of this, Susan, that we were really modeling to our students that ABET behavior of teamwork. I gave a shout out to you and Srijan and Lute several times during my course to say, I'm getting this great information from my colleagues and we're working together, but truly that was teamwork. So we were modeling what we were asking them to do.
And it was a joy to work together with all of you. So anyone have any questions?
I do, if nobody is asking questions, actually. So this was a great presentation. Thank you. It is great to see this collaboration. And I know from my experience in chemical engineering, it's been really good to talk to other faculty across the U.S. I just had a very actually specific question. Mary, you talked about salicylic acid separation betwin oil and water. Can you say a little bit more about that? Actually, I got all kinds of ideas listening to you, but there was something there I wasn't quite sure about, and I wonder if you could expand on that a minute.
Sure. Yeah, it was just a partitioning experiment. This is the one that we had to do by video. And so, basically the TA showed, how to set up the batch experiment. Here's the water, here's the oil. We're putting in the salicylic acid. We're letting it come to equilibrium, take the samples out. And then there was a color development. And so they measured it by spec.
Oh.
And so, yeah, we gave the students the data. It was a little bit of a challenge with freshmen. I had to derive some of the equations for them and have them apply them, whereas in a junior or senior class, they could have derived them themselves. But it was a good opportunity for them to work with real data, and we had them calculate the partitioning coefficients, like when we change the volume, I think of either of the water or of the oil, I can't remember which one, to see, okay, are they getting different partition coefficients? Did they expect to? So I think it was a very good experiment for them.
Thanks. If you don't mind, can I contact you separately and ask you some specific questions?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Dave, feel free to unmute yourself.
Hi, thanks for this presentation. I'm sorry I was a bit late, but I work with faculty that teach STEM classes and trying to convince them that they can replicate or augment lab exercises online sometimes is the response is, well, it's important for them to know these particular pieces of equipment, so I can't really replicate it using home tools. And I'm wondering, is there support? What I'm looking for is support for that they get this understanding of the processes, they get the understanding of the science, and that they can learn the technical aspects of that equipment later. Does anybody find that by using these at-home kind of kits actually gives them the understanding of what they're going to be expected to do later, and that the technical aspects can be learned at some other point?
From what my interviews with employers and alumni, and these are in environmental engineering, every one of them said the likelihood that they go in the lab and ever do a GC analysis, an HPLC analysis, even a VOD, is probably about yay big. But they're going to have to go out and sample. They're going to have to figure out how to preserve samples. They're going to have to figure out how to get that soil sample from point A to B without the bag that's in it, that they're putting it in, disintegrating or whatever. They're going to have to figure out how many samples that they need to get. So I used that feedback from the alumni, and I can share with you all just email me. I'll share the comments that I had gotten. I actually did it on Facebook in our alumni group. But that's what I use to kind of think through, okay, what can I do in a remote setting that is beneficial to our students in their future careers? I don't know if anyone else can.
So yeah, I could add a few things to this. I fully agree with all the things you've said, Susan, but if you would have somebody who would really want to push the issue and say we need to get, understand the types of analysis and the hands-on experiences, we did titrations at home, a little bit different than you would do them in the lab, but you can show you can share with a student what a real titration looks like, and then you can say, well, this is what you're going to be doing. It's basically the same thing with the home test kits. We did a lot of providing the background of the chemistry behind the test kits, and the chemistry obviously doesn't change when you do it with a more sophisticated setup than when you do it at home. Chemistry is the same, but we really pushed and emphasized the chemistry behind the test kits so that they, this is not magic. There is chemistry behind this kind of idea. And then the other thing in our field in environmental engineering, more and more commercial labs and are moving towards using colorimetric assays. And that's what these home test kits are. And so in some ways, they're very similar to what they would be doing if they were to be doing the real thing in a more, in a real lab. So kind of making those connections and demonstrating to them that it's really not that different, I think helps to, maybe that would help to convince the faculty that what they would be doing is actually not that far-fetched. Or
last thing I would like to add to the discussion here is, I think there is some merit in both of those approaches, and maybe in some situations, some scenarios, and some disciplines, getting in front of that equipment is important. So going forward, when we have back in person, then I would maybe hope that okay, we can still do some demonstration of using those higher end, more more expensive, more sort of used in the industry equipment in person in the labs, but then also give them the agency, the flexibility to do some more measurements at home. So they get both, but of course with that as Lud said, theory is the same behind both of them, for most part. So
Yeah, and I did the same thing in terms of all the chemistry. I went through all the chemistry. And actually the one that was really funny was that we had a hardness, one of the hardness tests was general hardness and carbonate hardness. And I assumed the carbonate hardness was carbonate hardness. Turns out it's actually alkalinity. And it was a bit of a challenge figuring that one out. And it was actually, I ended up on campus one evening collecting water from one of the students because none of the results were making sense. Going back home, doing the tests again. Actually, it turned out the RO unit in the res hall wasn't working properly, and that's why he was getting weird results. But, and it's because the aquarium community calls alkalinity carbonate hardness. So they actually learned a lesson about terminology and how we don't all necessarily talk the same language and how that can be quite confusing. So it was and this was happening in real time because I was trying to figure out what was wrong with the analysis too.
Yeah, and actually the funny thing is that we experienced the exact same thing, and Pedro and I were starting to worry about us doing something wrong or not quite getting it, and we were brainstorming, and then I sent an email to Susan, and then she shared all of that experience, and so then we felt more confident that what we were thinking was actually correct. So it was really collaborative in terms of how we work together with the different universities and trying to figure this out. The test kits, to figure out the chemistry behind the test kits isn't always easy. The companies don't provide a ton of information. So I had to go to the other, like to our, more sophisticated literature to try to figure out the chemistry often. And I really relied heavily on Susan's hard work from the previous semester. So I really can't thank Susan enough for her generosity in sharing all of her hard work with us, because it made it so much easier. Sometimes I was, working at the last minute because it was all new, and I was like, oh, I don't understand the chemistry of this test kit. And so I had the benefit of having Susan's information and then having standard methods and pull it all together right before the class to share it with the students.
I would absolutely second that, Lute. Yeah, I think Susan was really just a lifesaver. For me, this was a brand new course. And so, yeah, I was always working up until the last minute getting my things ready and knowing that not only I had written resources, but I could call her at any time and she would help. That was outstanding.
Oh yeah, I sent them a lot of like really late emails, like 10 p.m., 11 p.m. and Susan was answering my questions. So.
It's my pleasure. It really was a joy to work together.
Wonderful. And I want to thank all of our presenters for a really great and thorough going through of all your courses and the similarities and different experiences that you had, and a really nice question period at the end. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending our session today. And the recording will eventually be available on the conference MSU Media Space.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.